What is the greatest effort? I'll do it myself in history. In the early 60s, Ford was interested in purchasing Ferrari and poured a lot of money towards investigating their finances, their facilities, etc. Enzo Ferrari played along, but ultimately didn't really plan on actually selling to Ford, instead using the fact that Ford was interested in order to negotiate a favorable deal when he eventually sold to Fiat, a deal which allowed him to maintain control over the racing division of Ferrari. To say that Ford was pissed about having the rug pulled out from under them would be the understatement of the century. They figured out the only thing they could do that was guaranteed to piss off Enzo would be to go after his pride and joy, Ferrari's winning streak at Le Mans, and so they set out to do exactly that. They poured tons of money and resources into making a car that would accomplish exactly that, which ended up being the Ford GT40. Another major Enzo Ferrari blunder was Lamborghini's sports car division. Lamborghini was making tractors, and was pretty successful at that. Ferruccio Lamborghini owned a Ferrari sports car, and had issues with the clutch, and as he had some mechanical experience, he figured out the issue and reached out to Enzo with some suggestions on how it could be fixed, only to be met with contempt. Ferruccio was pissed off, and promptly decided he'd build a better sports car than Ferrari ever could, resulting in the Miura, which laid the foundations for Lamborghini to continue making sports cars. Napoleon. Dude busted out of prison and got the army that was against him on his side. History remembers him as a villain, but we learned a lot from that douchebag. Tony Iommi. Lost the tips of his ring and middle fingers on his right hand in a sheet metal accident at age 17. Told he'd likely never play guitar again, as he was left-handed and injured his fretboard hand. Tommy fashioned his own homemade thimbles and learned to play again. Not having full sensation in his fingers, he found it difficult to play, so he tuned his guitar down to loosen the strings, effectively creating the heavy metal sound Black Sabbath would eventually become famous for. It's not exactly a ducat I'll do it myself, but a professor called Richard Scoilver along with his research partner Georgina Long had developed breakthrough melanoma research and treatments. Last year Scoilver was diagnosed with a type of grade 4 brain cancer that was incurable. So him and his partner developed a new experimental treatment, with Scoilver being the first patient to receive it. A year later Scoilver appears completely cured with no sign recurrence of the brain tumor. You know that old wives' tale about how cracking your knuckles will cause arthritis? Well, Dr. Donald Unger decided to test that theory in the most extreme way he could. Once a day for 50 years, he cracked the knuckles in his left hand but not in his right hand. Neither hand developed arthritis, thus disproving the old wives' tale. 50 effing years, people. The dedication is just chef's kiss. This is very personal for me, but my grandpa, who raised me with my grandma, retired as an engineer, was bored and saw a need for what back then was called mobility equipment. He invented the standing frame in the 1980s. It allowed people with spinal issues, quadriplegia, to be transitioned from lying down to vertically standing up fully supported and safe without them leaving their bed. He made quite a few variations for different sizes and ages, and they sold all over the world. He simply said no one else was helping, so I did. All from our suburban garage in Sydney, Australia. He was awarded an Order of Australia, one of our country's highest honors. He was my hero. Sony going into gaming industry after failed partnership with Nintendo on CD add-on. The rest is the history of one of the best-selling home video game consoles, PlayStation. After the mutiny on the Bounty, Captain Bligh was set in a rowboat at sea off of Madagascar, with a jug of water and some hardtack biscuits. The bastard rowed himself back to England to bring the mutineers up on charges. Eater, read down for correct deeds. He actually was the victim of another mutiny a couple decades later. The second one was not an exciting sea yarn, however. Hello Major. During the summer of 1944, while he was out on a solo reconnaissance mission, he spotted two German soldiers nearby. Without hesitation, he killed one and captured the other. Then he went off to their commanding officer and a whole German garrison, taking down a few more soldiers along the way. Even when under fire from other Germans, He just kept walking and, on his own, managed to capture 93 German soldiers. On his own. In 1945, Leo was hit a landmine while in a truck, breaking his back, ribs, and both ankles. They told him he'd be discharged. Leo didn't care. So he snuck out of the field hospital, stayed with a Dutch family until he recovered, and then made his way back to his battalion. He volunteered to scout out the city of Zwaland. Once he set off, decided he'd just take the city himself. He convinced a German soldier to deliver a message to the German forces, and then spent the night causing havoc around the city. He fired shots, threw grenades, captured soldiers, and cleared out the SS building. His strategy worked so well that the Germans thought the entire Canadian army was invading, but it was only ducking Leo. By morning, the town was empty of Germans, and the Canadian army strolled right in. It literally took him one night. Fun fact, he also had an eye patch. He lost his eye earlier because of a grenade, but decided he could still be a sniper. The Wright brothers. Let go. They actually set out to build a working heavier than air flying machine themselves and never expected anyone else to do it for them. They originally believed they could rely on other people's knowledge and research for multiple things, such as airfoils, propellers and engines. They soon found out they couldn't. So they built their own wind tunnel to research airfoils, and later propellers so they could build wings that could generate lift, and propellers that would effectively propel the aircraft forward. After finding out nobody had ever considered building a lightweight engine, they figured out how to build one themselves. They even developed a warping trailing edge for their wings to control the roll movement of the aircraft, though similar functionality, now universally known as aileron, had been invented by others before them. Still, they appear to be the first to seriously consider the need for 3-axis control for aircraft. Then they flew their own contraption, which may have been necessary because it was so complicated to keep in the air one had to know it pretty intimately to have any kind of hope to keep it flying even for 12 seconds. And nobody had considered organized training of pilots yet, so shortly after the Wright brothers established a flight school also. While not world-changing, my wife had cancer and was going in and out of the hospital for months because of a life-threatening infection. There were a lot of things that I didn't like about her care. She finally got better, but her doctor said that she was going to be having GI problems and probably cancers for the rest of her life. I wanted her to have better care than she had gotten up to that point, so I quit being an engineer, went back to school, and became a registered nurse. Then, a few years later, she cheated on me with a guy she worked with who would post on Facebook about how there were dinosaurs on Noah's Ark. Barry Marshall. He thought the ulcers were caused by bacteria, but couldn't get ethics approval for human testing. So he drank H. pylori bacteria himself, and developed ulcers 3 days later, which confirmed his theory. He won the Nobel Prize for that. After the death of her husband, Pharaoh Thutmose II, Egypt was supposed to be ruled by her stepson, Thutmose III. However, he was still a child, and Hatshepsut was meant to act as regent until he came of age. Effort moment, instead of merely serving as regent, Hatshepsut declared herself pharaoh, one of the very few women to do so in ancient Egypt. She ruled for over 20 years, expanded Egypt's trade networks, commissioned grand architectural projects like her famous temple at Deir el-Bahri, and established a period of peace and prosperity. Well, he probably didn't say duck it, but Georges Lemaitre was a Belgian priest astronomer who basically came up with what is now known as the Big Bang Theory. He was at the famous, at least for physicists, 1927 Solvay conference, and while he was still fresh off getting his PhD, he managed to get to talk to Einstein about his idea of an expanding universe that started with a singularity. He was this young upstart kid among some of the greatest minds of the age: Marie Curie, Niels Bohr, Heisenberg, Dirac, and Einstein was dismissive of his notion, saying, "From the point of view of physics, this seems to me abominable." Lemaitre was right, of course, and years later Einstein had to admit that he was wrong. MSG Roy Benavidez. In Vietnam, he was a US Army Special Forces soldier, and one day in 1968 he heard over the radio that a patrol of 12 special forces and 9 Montagnard soldiers were surrounded by a NVA battalion. Benavidez jumped on a helicopter, armed only with a knife, to go help his comrades. Long story short, he ended up saving 8 of them, in a very similar way to Forrest Gump, killed several NVA soldiers, and took all manner of injuries and wounds from the enemy. In the end he had 37 separate bullet, bayonet and shrapnel wounds and lost consciousness on the way back to base. Mistaken for being dead, he was placed in a body bag, but as it was being zipped up by the doctor managed to spit in the doctor's face to prove he was alive. In 1981 President Reagan presented MSG Roy Benavidez with the Medal of Honor and said if the story of his heroism were a movie script, you would not believe it. After all that, it was respiratory complications stemming from diabetes that proved to be the only thing that could kill Benavidez when he died at the age of 63 in 1998. General Piccolo in the HBO Chernobyl series, when he drove the lead shielded truck mounted with a high-range dosimeter to obtain an accurate reading of the radiation levels. Clad even lived till 2003. Charles Guth got mad at Coca-Cola for not giving him discounts on syrup, so he bought Pepsi. Pepsi went from bankrupt to millions in sales in the 30s because of him. He was not a good person, but really knew how to deliver a good duck you. I also love Pepsi. The group of elderly people who tunneled under the Berlin Wall because they got told to duck off. I recall this exhibit from the Checkpoint Charlie Museum about 20 years ago. There was a group of elderly Germans who lived on the east side of the wall, and quite near it. They sought help from someone who ran escape routes to the west and did a lot of tunneling. He basically told them, "Nah, you're too old and useless to help me." They were not having it. They set out to make their own tunnel. They devised their own system of signals and codes with the planting of flowers. Each person had a role, from digging to dirt dispersal to manning the planting signals. And the best part is that they made their tunnel tall enough so they could all walk through instead of having to crawl as would have been the case with the other guy's tunnel. Leonid Rogozov diagnosed himself with an acute appendicitis while on an expedition in Antarctica in 1961. Being the only doctor on the ducking continent, he performed an appendicectomy on himself. That is to say, he cut open his own stomach, took out his intestines, removed the inflamed appendix, put the rest of his intestines back, sutured himself and went about his day like a boss. Linus Torvalds is really an interesting person. After creating Linux, the system running on most servers today, he also made JIT purely motivated by dissatisfaction with the then available versioning programs. And it became not only the versioning tool for Linux developers, his goal, but also the most popular versioning tool being used by software companies and developers today. In 1940, Polish army officer and Polish resistance soldier Witold Pilecki volunteered to be captured by the German occupier and be placed in Auschwitz concentration camp in order to infiltrate it. He successfully organized a resistance movement inside, collected a lot of intel on Nazi atrocities, and escaped it in 1943. In 1944 he fought in the Warsaw Uprising. He didn't accept the Soviet occupation of Poland and remained loyal to the Polish government in exile, based in London. He returned to Poland after the war in 1945 to report on the situation there. Sadly, he was arrested in 1947 by Communist Poland's secret police, tortured and executed in 1948. "Duck it, I'll do it myself" could have been Alexander the Great's motto. During the siege of a Malayan stronghold on the Hydraeots River, this is around the Indus Valley, during the Indian campaign, Alexander got impatient with his troops who were trying to get the scaling ladders in position. So he grabbed one and started climbing up, first guy up the wall, and started fighting one versus many. His bodyguards start freaking out and go to climb up behind him, except they're all heavily armored and armed, and in their rush they break the ladder. Alexander realizes he's stuck, and decides he can be super exposed up top and accomplish little, or he can hop down to the interior of the citadel to try to carve out space for the Macedonians climb over, join him, and open the gate. He does just that, continues to fight solo for a bit until some elite soldiers manage to join him. He takes an arrow that pierces his lung, fights a bit longer and collapses. His soldiers protect him though, open the gate, and the siege succeeds. He did survive the wound, though its long-term effects probably didn't help with the illness that eventually killed him. That's by no means the only time he did something of the sort either. Basically any assault on a city usually featured Alexander in the vanguard or on a special mission. He led a sneak attack at the siege of Syropolis, in modern-day Tajikistan, through a gap in the walls created by a low river channel. Took a nasty blow to the head. He went 1 volt 1 me bro at Darius the Persian Great King at the Battle of the Granicus. His helmet got messed up by a sword on the way. That's just a portion of it. Dude was crazy. Henry Ford. The West didn't recognize the Soviet Union as a nation when it first formed, but Ford thought that he could defeat communism through capitalism. He helped Stalin build a car factory in Russia. Ford had workers come from Russia to be trained, and he sent American workers to train workers in Russia. This helped Russia interior the industrial age. Stalin called him the greatest industrialist, which is insane when you think about how much of a capitalist Ford was. My friend. A realtor with genius level intellect while in her first year in university. She had a client that wanted to see a unit in a building. My friend called the front desk, which was also building management, dozens of times before anyone answered. The woman who answered the phone was very nasty and bad at her job. My friend's boyfriend was a software engineer. So my friend and her boyfriend spent a few days working on an automated system that fully replaced the unprofessional woman. She reached out to the building owner, pitched the system. Woman was fired immediately. My friend gained access to the unit. Horatio Pagani, while working at Lamborghini, suggested that they should buy an autoclave because it would allow them to produce professional lightweight carbon car bodies. Lamborghini refused, so Horatio left Lamborghini, took a bank loan and bought the machine himself. He started making the bodies himself and selling them to other automakers, including Lamborghini. After some time in 1992, Horatio Pagani founded Pagani Automobili and began designing and producing his own cars. China building their own space station after being rejected by USA from cooperation in International Space Station.